Is there a God? I mean, it's one of the biggest questions humanity has ever asked, right? It's shaped entire civilizations. Now, today, we're not going to try to answer that ourselves. Instead, we're going to explore how one very influential text builds its case, piece by piece. So let's dive in. So, that question is actually the title of a religious pamphlet that's been circulated really widely. And that pamphlet is the source for our entire explainer today. We're just going to follow its logic, step by step, to see exactly how it tries to build an answer. So, yeah, just to be clear, our source for this is this one pamphlet. We're going to walk you through its core logic, the evidence it presents, and the conclusions it comes to. Everything we look at today is pulled directly from the arguments it makes. All right, so here's the roadmap for how the pamphlet lays things out. It's basically a five-part argument. It kicks off by defining what it's even talking about. Then it moves to evidence, both out in the universe and inside of us. Then it takes on counterarguments, and finally, it lands on what it calls the ultimate proof. First things first. Before getting into any evidence, the pamphlet starts by defining its terms, which makes sense, right? How can you even begin to argue for something if you haven't explained what that something is? So, right off the bat, the pamphlet draws this really sharp distinction. It sets up two very different categories. On one side, you have what it calls a true God, the creator, eternal, all-powerful, and on the other side, you have false gods, which it defines as physical, man-made idols, things that can rust, break, and fall apart. And to really hammer this point home, it uses this short, pretty blunt poem. The logic here is simple. An object made by human hands can't possibly be the creator of those same humans. And this idea, this split between the creator and the created, becomes the foundation for everything else that follows. Okay, so with the definitions locked in, the pamphlet moves on to its first big piece of evidence. This is a really classic line of reasoning, often called the argument from design. The basic idea is that the universe itself contains clues that point to a creator. And to get us thinking on that cosmic level, it starts with this just mind-blowing number. It says you could fit 1.3 million Earths inside the sun. Now, the point isn't really about the exact math, it's about creating this sense of awe, to get you to stop and think about the sheer unimaginable scale of it all. But it's not just about being big, it's about being orderly. The pamphlet points to what it sees as the clockwork precision of the universe. You know, planets that follow these perfect, predictable orbits, the Earth spinning at just the right speed, tilted at just the right angle to give us seasons. The argument it makes is that this kind of intricate order doesn't just happen by accident. It implies a designer. This whole line of thought is summed up perfectly with a little anecdote about Sir Isaac Newton. The story goes, he had this intricate model of the solar system, and when a friend saw it, the friend marveled at the design. Newton's response gets to the core of the argument. If you can't believe this simple model was made by chance, how could you believe the real thing, the actual universe was? And now, the argument pivots. It shifts focus from the vastness of outer space to the inner workings of the human mind. The pamphlet argues that the next big piece of evidence for God isn't found out there, but right in here. So the first point it makes is that the urge to worship is a universal human thing. It claims that no matter where you look, from the most modern cities to the most isolated tribes, people have some concept of a God and some kind of religious instinct. The conclusion it draws from this is that this instinct isn't learned, it's hardwired into us. And it goes deeper than just an instinct. The pamphlet points to our conscience, that little voice inside that tells us right from wrong. Why do we feel guilt? Why do we feel uneasy when we do something we know is wrong? It even brings up an old saying, which basically means, in desperation, one calls to heaven. The pamphlet's answer to all this? It says that conscience is like an internal compass, put inside us by a divine lawgiver. Okay, so the pamphlet knows what you might be thinking. It anticipates skepticism, so it actually dedicates a whole section to tackling it head-on. It brings up some common arguments against God's existence and then tries to dismantle them. It does this using a little story. It introduces three characters: an astronomer who says, "I've looked through my telescope and never seen God," a surgeon who says, "I've opened up bodies and never found a soul," and an ethicist who says, "I've read all the books and none of them describe an afterlife." Together, they represent a kind of scientific, materialist view of the world. So how does the pamphlet respond? Well, its counterargument comes from an old woman in the story, and she just asks a really simple question. She asks the astronomer, "Have you ever seen the wind?" Of course not, but we see what it does, right? We feel it. The point here is that just because you can't see something with your eyes or your tools doesn't mean it isn't real. And she doesn't stop there. She turns to the surgeon and asks him, can your scalpel find love in a person's body or thought? And the pamphlet uses this to argue that some of the most powerful realities of human existence, love, consciousness, morality, are totally intangible. You can't just cut them out and put them under a microscope. To really drive home the idea that science and faith aren't enemies, the text then cites a survey. It says this survey looked at 300 of the most prominent scientists over the last 300 years. And according to the pamphlet, the result was that 92% of them were believers. Finally, it wraps up this whole section with that classic parable of the blind men and the elephant. You know the one. Each man touches a different part of the elephant. One feels the leg and says it's a tree. One feels the trunk and says it's a snake. They're all right in a limited way, but they're all wrong about the big picture. The text uses this to say that maybe human reason is just too limited to make absolute claims about what does or doesn't exist. All right, now we come to the final section. And here, the pamphlet makes a major shift in its whole approach. It argues that the real ultimate proof isn't found in logical arguments or scientific observation, but in something way more personal. So this is a huge pivot. After laying out all these arguments from cosmology and human nature, the pamphlet basically says, look, reason can only get you so far. The final, most powerful proof it claims isn't something you think about, it's something you experience. And it doesn't just leave this as some abstract idea. It actually ends with a call to action, an experiment, really, for the reader to try for themselves. It lays out these 4 specific steps as a kind of practical guide for anyone who wants to find that personal, experiential proof it's been talking about. This idea is all wrapped up in a single quote that the pamphlet uses right at the end. The suggestion here is that belief isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's not just a debate. It's presented more like a sensory experience, something you have to taste to really know it's real. And that's where the pamphlet rests its case. It builds an argument using logic and observation, but in the end, it says the most undeniable proof is something subjective, something internal. Which, you have to admit, leaves us with a really fascinating question. If the ultimate proof is personal, then what actually counts as evidence?